about titles and such, and I do want to indicate and remind each of us that our speaker today did his undergraduate work at what is now Calvin University, and he has a Master of Divinity and a Doctor of Divinity, those degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary. And with that, I introduce to you Doug.
Thanks, Judy. I wish you had mentioned where I went to kindergarten. That would be.
Well, you can tell us that. Tell us that.
No, that turned out to be the toughest year of all. Well, thank you, Judy, and thank you, Susan. And good morning to everyone. It's good to see you. Those of you I can see, or even just your names in the black boxes. We're already at episode 5, and I'm referring to our classes as episodes because this class is based on an excellent BBC video series, which is hosted or narrated by Diarmuid MacCulloch, who is professor of the history of the church at Oxford University. The series is based on a 1,000-page book he wrote about the history of the church. And even though the book and the TV series are now 10, maybe 11 years old, I think they hold up remarkably well. Today's episode is called The Evangelical Explosion. And it's an apt title, I think, because MacCulloch is going to take us all over the Christian map, from Moravians to Methodists to, even to Scottish, Irish Presbyterians and Black Christianity in the United States. He's going to introduce us to an almost mind-boggling diversity of religious expression. We're also going to hear from a wide variety of names, or we're going to hear the names mentioned, from Count Zinzendorf, who gave patronage and protection to the Moravians, to John and Charles Wesley, to Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. The latter had an enormous influence on the Wesley brothers, something you may not have known. Here's something for you to watch for and think about during this episode. And it grows out of our conversation at the end of last week, our discussion at the end. In that discussion following episode 4, there was some justified sadness, or call it consternation, over the continuing division and ongoing schisms within Protestant Christianity. Protestants, as we noted, seem predisposed to breaking off and starting something new. Well, this week, it seems to me, MacCulloch offers a different way of thinking about that. So maybe it's good that we're seeing this just a week after that conversation. But there's no attempt to justify the continuing schisms within Protestant Christianity. But MacCulloch suggests that we think about what has happened as an enormous explosion and relentless expansion. Those are his terms, beginning with the Reformation in the 15th and 16th centuries. So Christianity simply took off and spread around the globe. And then this is part of that same story. American Christianity severed the church from the state. So since the earliest years of the church, and I'm thinking Emperor Constantine here, since the earliest years, the church and the state existed in a kind of delicate balance of power. And American Christianity set out to end that. The First Amendment to the Constitution states that, as you all know, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And though that amendment has been interpreted in different ways, as you know, what it did for the first time in centuries was to get government out of the business of the church. And it was remarkably successful given, as you know, given the history of the church. MacCulloch rightly calls that a historic moment in church history, and Christianity was suddenly free. So this is what happened. People could choose. People suddenly had a choice that they did not have before, and Christianity was marketed, once again, MacCulloch's term, in a seemingly endless variety of consumer choices. And this brand of American Christianity, for better or for worse, was what spread around the globe. And then the episode ends with yet another shift that has taken place within Christianity, and that shift is to the Southern Hemisphere. And to give one example, at the beginning of the 20th century, 10% of Africans were Christian. And today, half of the population on that continent is Christian. I mean, that's just remarkable. And I'll throw in another little tidbit that the current Pope of the Catholic Church is the first Pope in church history to come from the Southern Hemisphere. McCullough doesn't say as much, but I'll give you my opinion that we haven't seen the end of this shift. And maybe we can talk about that at the end. It has already affected worship life in the church around the world. But in the years and decades to come, this shift will probably affect every other dimension of church life. That's my guess, especially as the church in the West continues to decline in a number of adherents. So I think that's enough by way of introduction. Let's watch episode 5.
Okay, folks, I am going to share my screen. And if I could just get a thumbs up from Judy or Doug if you hear sound.
It's 8 o'clock in the morning in Seoul, Korea, and I'm between crowds at the first and second service. This is Protestantism at the beginning of the 21st century. In the fifth part of my history of Christianity, I'm tracing the growth of an exuberant expression of faith that has spread across the globe. Evangelical Protestantism. Today, it's associated with full-blooded emotion, and by some, with conservative politics. But the whole story is not what you might expect. In my previous program, I showed how the Protestant faith broke away from medieval Catholicism to build a Protestant homeland in Europe. Now, I'll follow the events that led it to burst its boundaries. In America, Africa, even Asia. Protestantism was born out of a religious revolution in the 16th century, the Reformation. For 100 years, it made great strides across Europe with an explosion of new Protestant churches. Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, Anglicans. The response of the Catholic Church culminated in the 30 Years' War. That left Protestantism severely bruised. And by the end of the 17th century, it was largely confined to Northern Europe. It looked as though the Reformation had been stopped in its tracks. Yet from 1700, the story of Protestantism is one of relentless expansion. So what happened? What's the power of Protestantism that's made it circle the world? This is Herrnhut, on the far eastern border of Germany. The Protestant explosion might never have happened without a small group of Christians who settled here in 1722. And these are their gravestones, the Moravian Brethren. They had been persecuted by Catholics in their homeland, the modern-day Czech Republic. So they fled 250 miles west to safe Protestant Saxony. Once here, a Lutheran nobleman, Count Zinzendorf, headstrong, charismatic, rich, offered them his land and leadership for a new community.
Zinzendorf loved his Lutheran roots, but he was seeking something more. What made his new Moravian community stand out from other Protestants was its intensely personal, emotional relationship with God.
It was a rediscovery of the historical heart of the Christian faith, eternal salvation through a personal experience of Jesus Christ. There's still a strong Moravian community here. I joined them on one of their big days, the Advent service. In their new home, the Moravians worshipped several times a day, every day. And they sang, sometimes for days on end. The Protestant Reformation had certainly told human beings that they stood alone before God's judgment. But the Moravians were saying they could stand in a direct emotional relationship with God. Less of the head, more of the heart. It was an idea that would revolutionize Protestantism. And there was another innovation of the Moravians, which breathed new life into Protestantism. In Germany today, they're famous for their Christmas stars. But in the 18th century, they pioneered something far more significant. Christianity had always been a missionary faith, but that job was normally carried out by professional clergy. Ordinary Moravians took the unprecedented step of conducting missionary work themselves. And they weren't just interested in taking the message out to Europe. In fact, the very first Moravian missionary headed straight for the New World. I looked through the Moravian archives with its director, Dr. Rüdiger Krieger.
We have here the diary of the first missionary, Leonard Dober, who went to St. Thomas in 1732.
And St. Thomas is in the West Indies?
It's in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, yes. And for example, we have in this diary an entry from early January 1733 that reads, he went to the plantation to establish his profession as a potter. But the work was not very successful because of the bad condition of the clay. But they were using the time to speak to the slaves, to the local people there. And that is what the Moravians were looking for, a possibility to talk with the people about their religious feelings.
I think it's extraordinary that this humble working man crosses the seas to share his faith with other humble working people. What is it about the Moravians which impels them to do this?
The Moravians have the duty for everyone to talk about the faith, to talk about the gospel and to help people learning, being free to practice their faith. And you don't need being a pastor. Yeah, it's a new way of seeing living together in Christianity.
The Moravian archives are bursting with stories like Leonard Dober's. Immortalized in paintings, these pioneering missionaries spread the good news of Christianity as far as Africa and Greenland. It's why they are called evangelical, from the Greek word evangelion, meaning good news. Evangelical Christianity was on the march, but it wasn't quite the finished product. That would happen in England.
The Moravians had the gift of turning people's emotions into faith. They helped change the life of one young Englishman, an Anglican priest who then seized the future of Protestantism. His name was John Wesley.
Bristol, in the west of England, is one of the founding centres of a denomination which helped turn the Moravian dream into reality: Methodism. Its founder, John Wesley, started out as an Anglican clergyman, but one who appreciated the intense richness of Catholicism. Wesley met the Moravians in 1735 on board ship. He'd set sail from England with his brother Charles to take up a new job in America.
The brothers were already out of step with the established Church of England because they were high churchmen who emphasised the Catholic side of Anglicanism. At university in Oxford, they'd been part of a group of students who'd formed a holy club, which brought a sort of counter-Reformation Catholic intensity to low-temperature English Protestantism. They fasted, they went to communion as often as possible, they worked to help the poor. It was a very methodical way of trying to achieve holiness. And early on, someone, without apparently any friendly intent, called them Methodists.
The Methodists were not yet a new denomination, but the Wesleys' chance meeting with the Moravians would take them a step closer, especially as the brothers were heading for personal crisis in America. They fell out with local colonists. John had a disastrous love affair. They sailed home defeated and depressed. But back in England, they kept in touch with the Moravians. One night in 1738 in London, John attended Anglican evensong and then a Moravian prayer meeting. It was a powerful combination that would change both him and Protestantism. Something new happened to John Wesley that night. In a phrase now famous, he felt his heart strangely warmed.
While the solemn music of evensong was still ringing in his memory, he listened to Martin Luther's restatement of Paul's message to the Romans: "We're saved by faith alone." The Reformation came alive for him. A new fire, a new urgency came in his religion, and it burst through the hymns of the Moravians to create a new message for his generation.
For both Wesley brothers, what mattered in their faith now was a direct relationship with God. They wanted to spread this message of salvation, just as the Moravians had done. But the Wesleys also brought a new element to Protestantism that helped it reach out to millions more around the world. They saw that society was being transformed around them, and they hurried to bring frightened and bewildered folk the gospel good news in the middle of huge social change. In the 18th century, industrialization displaced millions from the countryside to new population centres, such as the modern-day outskirts of Bristol. But the Church of England had no buildings here. For a rather prissy parson, John Wesley found a surprising solution. An old friend from Oxford, George Whitfield, had taken to preaching in the open air. John decided to give it a go at Hannam Mount, then close to a large mining community. According to local Methodist Colin Craddock, it was a risky choice of venue.
Cock Road, which is close by here, was a notorious area for lawlessness and so on. And then there were the miners themselves, who in 18th century society, they must have been the real lowest of the artisans, I imagine.
So the sort of place your mother tells you not to go.
Well, it was, definitely. I don't think anybody of any respectability would come out here, and for Wesley to do it was just absolutely astounding.
And the effect he had on people.
He had a dramatic effect on them. The miners, wet, these black sooty faces, had white lines down them. Amazing.
For the first time, someone cared enough to come looking for the miners to save their souls. It's often forgotten that a concern for social justice is part of the original DNA of evangelical Christianity. The Methodists went on to build their own chapels that were quite separate from the Church of England. This was their first, John Wesley's own headquarters in Bristol, his new room. And it wasn't just the words of John Wesley that moved people. It was also the magnificent hymns of his brother Charles.
Strange, it's so cool and classical and ordered. Yet in 1739, it would have been deafening in services here, with shouts of joy and repentance, and the roar of Charles's new hymns about Christ's blood and sacrificial death.
Maybe that initial intensity has cooled for many Methodists today. But you can still get a glimpse of the fervour of those early meetings all over the modern evangelical world. By 1800, around 500,000 people in Britain attended Methodist worship. That's over 5% of the population, grown from nothing in 60 years. Heartfelt Protestant religion was hugely popular in Wales and spread among Scottish and Irish Presbyterians too. It was an evangelical revival.
The evangelical message reached all levels of society. Like the Moravians in Germany, the evangelicals discovered an intensely personal reformation. They reached into their Bibles to meet Christ, but they also reached into the depths of their own souls to make that meeting complete. And they hungered to get others to do the same.
Up till now, the Catholic Church had set the pace for Western Christian missionary work.
Oh, great. Tea, please.
Yes.
But that was about to change with a religious revival across the Atlantic. In the New World, Protestantism would triumph. In America, there's a bewildering range of Protestant denominations. Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Unitarian, Episcopalian, Seventh-day Adventist, you name it. Does that mean Protestants constantly flounce off and start something new? Well, they do. But that's also really the key to the exuberance of American religion. first shoots of American diversity lie in an outburst of heartfelt religion in New England in the 1730s. At the start of the revival was a brilliant scholar, a congregational minister in Northampton, Massachusetts. His name was Jonathan Edwards.
Edwards insisted that we must worship God with the whole person, mind and emotion. And from the greatest philosopher to the smallest child, we must love God in simplicity. He once said in a sermon, "If ever you arrive at heaven, faith and love must be the wings which must carry you there." It was Edwards's congregation which first experienced revival in America.
But there was more to come, the rousing spirit which Europe was now experiencing. It was brought by an evangelical Englishman Edwards invited to address his congregation. George Whitefield, the same man who inspired John Wesley to preach outdoors. He's buried in the Old South Church in Newburyport. And that's where I met an American church historian who believes that Edwards got more than he bargained for.
While Edwards welcomed the message, he didn't really like Whitefield's manner of delivery. Whitefield, of course, brought this new style of preaching that was dramatic, it was extemporaneous, that is, he didn't use any manuscripts. He would rely on inspiration, moving back and forth, using gesture, enacting scenes from the Bible. It's said that people would faint when he pronounced the word Mesopotamia.
Sounds to me as if Whitefield would be a welcome visitor for Edwards, but not necessarily a welcome colleague.
Tell me about it. After Whitefield leaves, his congregation is a wreck. So Edwards tries to separate the physical from the spiritual. And he says to his congregation, what were you more impressed by? Were you more impressed by the eloquence of the preacher? And what was more lasting for you? Was it his message, the message of the new birth? And did it have any difference in your heart?
The reality is that the revival unfolding in New England needed a bit of what both men had to offer. The intellect and considered argument of Edwards balanced the crowd's emotional response to Whitefield's challenges.
Well, this is the grave of George Whitefield. It actually feels remarkably like the shrine of a Catholic saint until you realise that he's actually sharing the basement of this church with the church heating system. He was an extraordinary preacher. In the open air, his voice could carry so 10,000 or more people could hear him. And he came to this country, to a movement which is already springing up in all sorts of churches, the movement we collectively call the Great Awakening.
In the 18th century, emotional preachers like Whitefield stirred passions as never before. He demanded that people made choices. Protestant churches like the Presbyterians and Baptists were turned into missionary powerhouses.
Thank you, Joe. All right, we're on our way. Now, a little bit about Boston. This was the birthplace of the American Revolution, our struggle for freedom from British rule.
Evangelical Protestantism now swept through much of America.
Here in Boston, you can always tell you're on landfill if the streets
And it did so for very special, very American reasons.
All right, here we go, into the Charles River. Now, in the 1760s, a group of Boston citizens who called themselves the Sons of Liberty began rioting in the streets to protest British rule and British taxes.
The spread of evangelicalism was an accidental side effect of the American Revolution, sparked by a famous incident here in Boston.
In the course of the next few hours, we took 342 chests of tea, threw it in the harbor. King said we had to pay the tax when it hits the dock. He didn't say anything about when it hits the water.
In 1773, the Boston Tea Party launched a series of clashes that led to American independence from Britain.
High above us,
To the consternation of many Christians, the Founding Fathers decided to separate church from state in their new republic's federal constitution.
By the time he gets to the door of this church,
In time, the privileges of established churches in individual states also ended.
upon the city. Time for the signal.
After centuries as an official religion tied to the state, Christianity was cut free. All the gains of evangelical Protestantism might seem to have been at risk. The separation of church and state was an historic moment for the Christian faith. Since the 4th century, mainstream Western Christianity had been an arm of government. Now it stood alone. You might think that this would be devastating for churches. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The historic decision to separate church and state had a wholly unexpected effect on the future of Protestantism. It let people choose. You can see the results of that decision in the huge number of denominations that still sprout and flourish right across the United States. In exchange for breaking all federal ties with the church, the Founding Fathers gave Americans religious liberty. And that meant the freedom to choose any Christianity, no matter how emotional. It unleashed another evangelical revival, a second Great Awakening, this time on America's western frontier. In 1800, Kentucky was in the Wild West. It's not surprising that some of the wilder manifestations of modern evangelical Christianity found a home here. An annual gathering marks the events. Remember, this was a frontier. All sorts of people were chancing their luck. Many of them came from Britain. That was really important for what happened here, because among them were Scottish Protestants whose people had already moved once to settle in Ulster, in Ireland. Frontier Ulster had the same sense of danger, excitement, limitless potential as the Wild West frontier in Hollywood movies. It was actually in Ulster that Protestants first gathered in huge numbers for open-air Holy Communion services. And when they came to North America, they brought that memory with them. It was on this new frontier that the idea of open-air revival gained a new lease of life.
Two volumes of John Logan's son. John Logan was a Scottish Presbyterian. This particular communion, there was service late in the weekend, and during the sermon, one woman spoke out, cried out, seeking assurance of her salvation, which of course that disrupted the service. And at the end of the sermon, the organizing ministers left the church. But the congregation stayed inside. They seemed to be waiting, if you will, for what God was going to do next.
Well, this must have been actually quite troubling for the ministers.
Oh, absolutely. And I've read that they held a small conference outside the building to decide what they should do. And their decision was, and I think a very wise one, is they would not interrupt what was happening inside. In fact, I believe they may have gone back in and joined, and that's when they saw God's Spirit fall. People were falling out. Slain in the Spirit would be a term that we would call it in modern times.
It sounds as if people are trying to find ways of expressing what they feel beyond what they can normally do in church.
Oh, absolutely. You had the running exercise where people would be so enthralled with what they felt God doing in them that they would literally run, I don't know, circles, run around the camp. I'm not sure. But then you had the barking exercise. You had a laughing exercise. When the power of God comes upon you, sometimes it has to come out in some way, or you feel like you may burst. God so loved the world, yea, the ungodly world, which had no thought nor desire. You can follow the Spirit's leading.
The emotion raced across the new republic. The white-hot religion of the Second Great Awakening lasted almost 50 years. And it helped create something new. Congregations that up till now had remained offshoots of European churches had fresh choices. You might almost say consumer choices. Christianity was marketed with all the flair and swashbuckling enterprise that the United States showed in its commerce and industry. Frontier Protestantism had become not only popular, but distinctly American. The energy of the revivals led to new identities for Christianity. From Seventh-day Adventists and Millerites to Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they saw America at the center of God's purposes. Now, it's easy to stress the emotional side of American evangelicalism. But we need to remember that many of them were also socially radical. Like Methodists, American evangelicals offered marginal groups fresh hope. The message entranced African Americans, most of whom were still enslaved. Evangelicalism offers a choice to turn to Jesus. These people had never had a choice in their whole lives. They went on to found their own churches. Belle Meade Plantation near Nashville couldn't have functioned without slaves. On its gracious lawns, I talked about the importance of evangelical revival for African Americans with scholar Dennis Dickerson.
In these camp meeting venues, persons high and low, black and white, rich and poor, were invited to hear the gospel. And many of the scriptures that were preached obviously were heard by African Americans as ensuring their equality. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. God hath made of one blood all people to dwell upon the earth.
But many slave owners were evangelical Protestants, and many evangelical Protestants justified slavery in reference to the Bible. Were they just being stupid and selfish?
The slaves knew that the Bible had competing themes. Those who wanted to justify slavery often had to appeal to those many instances in the scriptures, particularly in the Old Testament, sometimes in the New Testament, that there was hierarchy, there were servants, there were slaves that seemingly were sanctioned by religious authorities. The slaves themselves, however, developed their own interpretation. They could easily cite that same God who had liberated the Hebrews and had brought them through an Exodus experience, would also do the same for them in the United States.
There was another important and unexpected reason why Bible-believing African Americans accepted the religion of their oppressors. Some white evangelicals came to see slavery as evil and anti-Christian, and they campaigned alongside the enslaved for abolition. In our present age, it's worth remembering that together, evangelical Christians once led this great rebellion against the common understanding of the Bible, overturning the moral assumptions of their time. By the mid-19th century, the most dynamic and expansionist society in the world was a Protestant great power, the United States. I think that we should forget old cliches about a Protestant work ethic, contrasting somehow with Catholicism. We're looking here at a huge historical coincidence. Circumstances converged to make the world's leading industrial nation Protestant. And so its brand of Protestant culture also became a world-conquering force. Even non-Christian Japanese hurried to copy American capitalism. In fact, you could say mission had been thrust upon Protestants now by a dramatic turn of events in the heartland of Catholicism in Europe.
From 1789, the French Revolution signalled the end of the old world. The French monarchy collapsed. The Roman Catholic Church was tottering. Surely these were the signs of the end of the world. Now was the time for Protestants to proclaim the truth before it was too late. So, just at the moment when Catholic missions were faltering, Protestants set out to conquer the world.
Africa was not only a long way from the Protestant heartlands of America and Europe, it was also culturally very distant. Counter-Reformation Catholicism had tried and failed to make serious inroads here. And on the West African coast, the reason is still plain to see. This is one of the many forts where captured Africans were held before being shipped to the New World as slaves. Not surprising, then, that few West Africans listened to any talk of Christianity from Europeans.
For 3.5 centuries, the slave trade had poisoned relations between Europe and Africa. Now, the campaign for its abolition proved vital for the success of African Protestantism.
This is the Anglican Cathedral in the Ghanaian capital, Accra. Christianity here descends from Africans who, freed from slavery, returned to Africa. They were mostly fervent evangelicals, impatient to help their fellow Africans choose salvation. And this gave a new idea to the British Anglican Church Missionary Society, the CMS. Self-governing churches overseas.
The society began looking to these West African settlements for local leadership, and they found one outstanding candidate, a young man who'd been rescued from slavers and who'd settled in Sierra Leone. His name was Ajayi, but he took 2 English names, in fact, the names of a committee member of the CMS, Samuel Crowther. So, Samuel Ajayi Crowther came to England, trained for the ministry, and was ordained an Anglican priest.
Hallelujah. I want you to give God a mighty clap offering. And then a mighty sound offering.
Crowther set about sowing the seeds of African Anglicanism with a distinctly evangelical flavour. He saw that to succeed, Protestantism would have to adapt to African culture. He translated the Bible into his native Yoruba language and was successful enough to be given the post of Bishop of Western Africa. But Crowther's initiatives were ahead of the times, and his impact was limited. He wanted authority over both black and white missionaries in West Africa, but his English white superiors had a problem. Kwabena Asamoah Giyadu, a Ghanaian church historian, told me what it was.
When I was a boy, I collected stamps and I have vivid memories of the stamp commemorating Bishop Crowther, and I saw it as a great success story that there should be a bishop from West Africa. But was it such a success story?
Yes and no. For an African with a slave past to rise to the level that Crowther did was by itself an achievement. But he was betrayed because they wanted to put an African at the forefront of the mission work. But I think when it came to the point where they then had to hand the destiny of the church into African hands, then they had a problem.
So they wanted their cake and eat it.
We may well put it that way.
White European missionaries did try to evangelize this vast continent. The most famous attempt was that of David Livingstone in southern and central Africa. But his was actually an heroic failure. He made only one recorded convert, who later fell out with him and formed his own church. This was the same lesson that Crowther had taught the church. Christianity could take root in Africa, but only if it was led by African missionaries. And eventually, it was.
What was happening quietly through the 19th century was that Africans themselves were doing mission in ways that Europeans hardly noticed. So young men would travel, they'd go to services in new places, they'd learn new hymns, and they'd bring them home. Market women would sell Christianity using their sales skills. Teachers would be taught by the missionaries, and when the missionaries moved on, they'd go on teaching. They'd be able to tell Africa about Christianity in African terms.
At the start of the 20th century, perhaps 10% of Africans were Christian. Today, it may be half the continent. Astonishing. How's it happened? One curious catalyst was the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Many European missionaries left, and the ghastliness of the war didn't say much for the Christianity of Europe. Two good reasons for Africans to take control. One of the greatest pioneering African missionaries was William Wade Harris. He was a political activist in prison here in West Africa, when in 1913 he had a revelation that he'd been chosen as a prophet. Once released, he set out to convert Africans to Christianity.
You have to picture Harris striding through the villages of the Ivory Coast and here in Ghana. He's dressed in a simple white robe, he's carrying a 6-foot cross and holding a gourd of water. With him are his team of 2 or 3 women who are singing, playing the calabash to bring up the spirits of the guardian angels and the Holy Spirit, while Harris is exhorting people to give up traditional religion.
But his converts didn't want to join the established European churches because their services just didn't celebrate God in the way Africans wanted. Worse still, European-run churches condemned African practices like polygamy. So Harris's followers chose to form their own network of churches. The Church of the 12 Apostles is one descendant. This is a Friday service for healing. The congregation is mainly made up of women market traders. They've taken the day off, leaving the men to work on while they worship. This seems a million miles from the churches I know back in Oxford. But that's the great strength of Christianity, its ability to adapt and assimilate. Behind this very African experience, I can see features which all communities value.
In Western Europe, all these things that we've got here are elsewhere. They're on the dance floor in a nightclub. They're in the football stadium. They're in the therapy room. Here, it's all brought together into one. You're worshipping God within a very tight system. It looks spontaneous, but of course it isn't. It's got its own rules. It builds up. It dies back. There are people to help you find your way through it. They push you even into it. And it's about healing all around you. The power of God is pushing out of a community which is dressed up to be like you, to be with you in your time of trouble, in your everyday boredoms, your frustrations. You bring them here, you dump them, and you dance on them.
You know, in Africa or in Ghana, we believe that every sickness, it's caused or is a curse or is caused by the devil. So we believe that once the problem is spiritual, it should be solved spiritually.
And when the music happens, that's part of the healing.
The music invokes the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to come upon the leaders or the healers. And when even the music is going on, some are even healed. Yes, when the music is going on, you hear people shouting, they are getting healed. Though they are not touched, but they are getting healed by the music. And that is why people come to us. We are always the last to be approached. The last to be approached and the first to solve the problems.
Local leaders across the continent led a quite breathtaking growth in this new African Christianity. From the 9 million Christians in Africa in 1900, there's now more than 380 million. And half of those are Protestant. It marks the biggest ever shift in the center of gravity of Christianity.
2,000 years ago, it was in Jerusalem. Later, Constantinople. By 1600, it had shifted to Spain. Today, the midpoint of Christianity is Saharan Africa. There are as many Christians to the south and east of Timbuktu as there are to the north and west.
The key to Protestant expansion has been the willingness to change. This direct, heartfelt encounter with God started with the Moravians. It was boosted by Methodism and evangelical revival. The message swept across America in the Great Awakenings, and it spread across Africa. With each new setting came new Protestant churches. By the 20th century, they even challenged the historic ascendancy of Roman Catholicism in Latin America. It's taken the number of Christian denominations worldwide to more than 30,000. But now it's expanding even further. And it may be that Protestantism is moving too far away from the teachings of Jesus. Today, South Korea is a prosperous nation with a thriving economy. It's hard to imagine that only 60 years ago, this was a traumatized and impoverished country, reeling from the effects of Japanese occupation.
Throughout the Japanese occupation, the churches were prominent in the struggle for freedom. It meant that Christianity was identified with national suffering and national pride. After liberation, it became involved in another struggle, rebuilding a shattered Korea. Here it produced one of the most dramatic success stories in modern Christian history: Korean Pentecostalism. The Yoido Full Gospel Church started with 5 Koreans meeting in a tent. Now it has over 750,000 members worldwide. The hymns might be in Korean, but the tunes are straight out of the evangelical revivals. In fact, Pentecostalism has built on a 19th century American tradition. It was called the Holiness Movement. It harked back to the revivals of Wesley's Methodism. At its heart is the same emotional side of faith, the direct, personal choice for God. What's new is that Pentecostals have found God in a way with very little precedent in Christian history. They've met the Holy Spirit, who's often seen the Cinderella of the Trinity. The Bible says that 50 days after the death of Jesus, the Holy Spirit descended upon the apostles at the Jewish feast of Pentecost. It was a life-changing experience. The disciples are said to have spoken in tongues, an unknown but sacred language which all present could understand. They were filled with such energy, they chose to spread the message of Jesus to the world. Pentecostals believe present-day Christians can also receive those gifts of the Spirit. And that's what you're seeing here today. But there's another aspect to the success of Korean Pentecostalism which is far more controversial. It's the promise of good fortune and prosperity for believers. That's been christened, by those who mistrust it, the prosperity gospel. It came out of the interwar years in America. Capitalism in the service of Jesus. American consumer choice for God. In the past, Protestantism offered hope of eternal salvation regardless of problems in the here and now. In Korea, that assurance has become more immediate. You no longer need to wait for the hereafter to reap the benefits of the Christian faith. Is this one adaptation too far? That's certainly what I heard from a Korean Presbyterian theologian, Professor Sang-Yun Kim.
It's simple. If you go to church and give offering, you'll be blessed. Your economic success is guaranteed.
So this really is prosperity?
That's right.
Can you see problems in the Bible with this message?
Yes. It is very hard to a rich man to get into heaven. You know, from that passage, I think sooner or later, you are not able to see any Koreans in heaven. Because, you know, prosperity gospel had a positive contribution during the 1970s and 80s. It provided a new set of hope. But nowadays, ordinary Koreans or society think that Korean Protestants are a little bit selfish to ask more offerings, bigger churches, you know, bigger buildings. People think that that is not the basic tenets of religion.
The
The Yoido style of Pentecostalism has all the glitz of a Hollywood musical from the 1950s. I was intrigued to meet the man behind the phenomenon. Pastor David Yonggi Cho is now retired, but I asked him about his memories of those early years when he first began spreading the gospel message in Korea.
When I went to preach gospel to the poor people, their suffering was enormous, and many of them said, we don't need any religion. If you have such a wonderful heaven, why don't you give a part of heaven right now here? We need real God who helps us. So I really prayed to God, and I found out that in the redemption of Jesus Christ, I could find the redemption of spirit, life, and physical body. Jesus Christ was crucified on the cross, redeeming us from sin, sickness, and curse. So I call that triple gospel of Jesus Christ. And I began to really build up hope in the heart of people, that it is not just a religion beyond the death, but a religion now, here. And that really moved the heart of the people to come to the Pentecostal church.
Does this mean that salvation will always lead to worldly success and wealth?
When they are saved, they stop smoking, they stop drinking, they begin to save money, they stop gambling, they don't waste the money. Naturally, by doing that kind of life, they are becoming wealthy.
The Yoido congregation is one of the most spectacular faces of evangelical Protestantism in the 21st century. So it was interesting that I heard quite a sober tone in Pastor Cho's reflections on his lifetime of success, but not actually a rejection of the link between worldly success and salvation. Korean Pentecostals are doing what Christians have always done: reflect on a host of voices within the Bible and make their own choices. Is it fair to accuse them of throwing away core values? On the question of wealth, they'd be entitled to point out that the New Testament is ambiguous. Do you reject riches or work hard and use them well? Jesus and the Apostle Paul give you different answers. And Pentecostals may well be a pointer to the Christian future. At the moment, they look and sound like evangelical Protestants, but I wonder if that's where they'll stay. This is a religion blown by the Holy Spirit, and you never know where that'll end up. The Spirit doesn't hide in the pages of a book, even when the book is the Bible. Protestantism has come a long way since the first Moravian missionaries were inspired to go out into the world and tell others about their faith.
Protestantism succeeded because it gave a new identity to people facing new situations. In the process, it changed as much as its converts. But a strange things happened. The Protestant faith now faces its greatest challenge ever, not from some distant culture, but from the Protestant homeland, Europe.
As always, a great deal to think about and respond to. If you're shy or just would prefer to put your comment in the chat box, please do that. Or if you have a response, please raise your hand. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes, I
can
can
hear
hear
you.
you.
And just be aware that you're all muted currently. So if you have something to say, just make sure you unmute yourself.
You know, toward the end, I was so struck by this comment that I wrote it down. McCullough said Protestantism may be moving far from the teachings of Jesus. And then, I mean, that seemed to hang out there without further explanation. And then he moved into the prosperity gospel and the church in Korea. But boy, that's a remarkable statement. Protestantism may be moving too far from the teachings of Jesus. I wonder if anybody else heard that or responded to it.
I heard that also, and I also wrote it down in my notes. And I'm just wondering, of all that we've seen over these past 4 weeks, how much of it has been centering on the teachings of Jesus as we read them in our Bibles? I suspect that much of what we saw the first 2 weeks was on church buildings and worship styles, and not so much on someone's reading of scripture. I think that's something that came to the fore in the Protestant era. And I think that as the Korean pastor explained, that there is some basis, depending on where you're looking and what you're emphasizing. You can find a lot of different things in scripture to justify the prosperity gospel, for example, that yes, when people do read scripture or they hear the message of the good news, they may be forced to change their lives and give up some of their old habits of drinking, smoking. I would add perhaps gambling to that, and other things that are really not conducive to the good life. But the good life is not necessarily consumerism. And I think it's so easily evolved. And I saw it in China when Bill and I lived there for several months, that people conflate consumerism, prosperity in a way that has to do with buying things with Christianity. And right next to, not far from a Christian church in the city where we were in Fuzhou, there was a huge building that had on its billboard, a big side of the wall was Amway, and that bothered me somewhat.
Yes, I'm going to have to leave very shortly to prepare for a conversation with Sam Bahur for Kairos. I want to say this, though, that the genius of Protestantism, it seems to me, is that people have been willing to go where most Christians were not willing to go, with blacks, with the marginalized, with coal miners in Britain, with slaves in Africa. This has been blessed by the Spirit, it seems to me, and the excesses are very real, but there have been, for example, South Korea exploded with Christianity because they felt that American Christians were taking their side against oppression, against the communist oppression. So you have literally millions of Christians in Korea, and from the things that I've learned about it, they are indebted to United States Christians for taking their part instead of being overwhelmed by communist atheism. So thank you for this series, Doug.
Thank you, John. I'm glad for your comment. I wonder if anyone noticed the thread that sort of holds this episode together, and the thread can be described as emotional intensity. I mean, it goes all the way back to the Moravians. They were looking for some connection between the head and the heart. So it continues through Methodism, and I would say all the way to the kind of worship we observed in Africa and Korea. So I have to say, I was not raised in a Protestant church with any need for emotional intensity, but that seems to be the driving factor for this explosion that McCullough is describing for us. I'll go a step further and say one of the reasons I'm a believer today is that I think faith makes sense, helps me to make sense of the world, helps me to make sense of my own life. But the emotional intensity part of it has never been part of my life or my training, my background. I'll tell one story about that. A church I served partnered with a village in South Africa. The village was Acorn Hook, and we were helping them to build a freshwater well. And so a group of us went one time to South Africa, and I preached in the church, which I have to say was a thrill of a lifetime. But I preached what for me was a pretty long sermon. It was about 18 minutes. I mean, that's about the outer limit for Presbyterians. And when I was finished, I sensed that I had failed utterly. So the the pastor of the church stood up and basically re-preached my sermon, but in far greater detail. So what had been an 18-minute offering from me became more like an hour when he added his embellishments. Anyway, our group was introduced to a whole different kind of worship style that day, with emotional intensity and with longing and passion. It was really, really remarkable.
My daughter belongs to an evangelical church in, she had been in one in Chicago and now in LA. And it's really interesting when you go to church because there's a worship band with drums and pianos and guitars and 2 or 3 singers, and all. You never sing a hymn that you ever known before because all of the words to the music come up on a big screen overhead, and there's lots of hand waving and whatever. And this is not a Black church by any means. This is a pretty much looking like you and I. And it's an interesting experience because the preacher is in a central church and he comes on a big screen, and they have individual ministers at the church that are local. But there were 5 churches, and this had originally been a little Lutheran church, so it looks like a regular church from the outside, but then you get inside and it's all folding chairs and whatever. So anyway, but she went to Mexico, and I think I mentioned it earlier, as trying to convert little Catholic kids to be evangelical Protestants. And I think it's really strange to convert Christians to a different version of Christianity. I mean, that seems to be a interesting phenomena. And so anyway, but it certainly is different. And there are churches like this all over the United States. I mean, she was raised as a Unitarian and then became a Presbyterian and then joined the Vineyard Church. And she's in a Vineyard Church now in California. So it's an interesting progression of changes for sure. And I think she probably feels that I'm not quite Christian enough, or have enough faith or whatever. And when her dad was dying, there was a really huge push for him to say he'd accepted Christ, and he just couldn't. He's always been an agnostic, and he died an agnostic. But anyway, so it's a big crisis in our family over beliefs, just with her evangelical Christianity and feeling that he was doomed to hell for the eternity. So anyway, it's interesting phenomena for sure.
Thank you for that. I think somebody responded to my comment about a consistent thread through this latest episode, and it's from Marilyn, who says the other consistent thread I heard through this episode was choice. So good, Marilyn, do you want to say any more about that? In my introduction, I mentioned that that the explosion of evangelical Christianity, as McCullough describes it, has a distinctive American tone to it, and that tone is all about consumerism and marketing and choice. So yeah, that definitely is a theme as well.
I think the choice part of it is if you don't choose their way, you're relegated to being a bad person or not saved or whatever. So if you make the same choice they make, it's a good thing. But if you don't, you're kind of disregarded, I guess is with maybe a term. So hopefully you make the choice that they make, but if you don't, then that's not such your, it's you're put down, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sorry that that's your experience. And I mean, one of the criticisms of evangelical Christianity today is that it can be judgmental, and often is. Yeah. If it makes you feel any better, my mother thinks that I've strayed, by becoming a Presbyterian, I've strayed far from the path.
Yeah.
This is Louis Morel. I have a question about history. We recognize Europe as being Christian for centuries, but translating that to Africa in the 20th century, was any African society monotheistic, or were they all polytheistic? And how difficult was it to convert from that frame of mind to a monotheistic religion?
Do we have anybody in the group who has a background in world religions? I mean, that's an interesting question.
We need to talk to David and Clara Brouwer. They both grew up in missionary families in the Belgian Congo, I think. So they would be a resource for us. But unfortunately, David and Clara are not computer people, so they're not able to join in any of the hash things during this thing. But they would be the people to ask, because they actually grew up in Africa with missionary parents, and so they might have some insight for us.
I mean, you could ask a similar question about the growth of the church in Asia and the kind of move culturally and intellectually that a person would have to make to go from, I mean, whatever the historical religions are there, to Christianity, as similar kinds of moves that people made.
Indeed, and I'm not familiar with Shintoism, for example, that's practiced in Japan. And so I can't compare, but it's an interesting concept to convert so many people from perhaps millennia of practices into something radically different.
Yeah.
Audrey has a hand up. Audrey, go ahead.
Yeah, several years ago, I put together a class for HASP on architecture of 3 churches in Holland. We visited St. Francis and the Third Reformed Church and Engedi. And Engedi is a church that adapted the Kmart building over on Chicago Drive. And at first, or initially, some of the people who were attending the class were a little uncomfortable about going to Engedi, as well as myself, and but very much interested in how they'd adapted a large building to the church. And the response from the people attending was they were overwhelmed with and impressed with how they had, part of the course was to find how the church was adapting its architecture to the needs of the community. And at Engedi, you had staff roller skating around from room to room. They had built rooms. They had a skate park so that it would encourage the young people who couldn't skateboard in the wintertime could come to church. And so their congregation kept building and building. And so in talking about change, Engedi, and I don't know, well, at the end of the session, a number of people went up to the person who was the minister at Engedi, and they wanted to bring their minister from their church to meet with the Engedi staff to learn more, because it looked like a clever marketing tool, which it is. And I just wondered if any of the people in this class had gone through that experience, and if anything had happened since then in terms of Engedi. And would you consider Engedi an evangelical church?
Oh, I don't know enough about that church in Holland to make comment about that. But it is an interesting phenomenon that church buildings themselves are undergoing considerable change, and that shopping centers are being adapted. I mean, I can't say that I'm a big fan of that, but I've reached a point in life where I have some regret over all the money that I raised to renovate, or in some cases build new buildings. I think maybe this, the criticism, the critique that's coming from evangelicalism is probably one we need to pay attention to. I don't have a good sense of where the building fits anymore in thinking about the church. We have another comment.
I'll read a comment from Demetra. Do you think the Christians in Africa can withstand the assault by the Islam extremists, Al-Shabaab? Again, Christianity's been threatened by Islam for centuries. And I would think that as Europe has been withstanding the assault of Islam in decades or centuries ago, that I think that Africa can put, I think it has strong foundation in its Christianity that it might be able to withstand the extreme of Islam. That's just my opinion. Any other comments to this?
My younger daughter spent a semester in Accra, and it was impossible for her to not go to church. There was so much pressure in Accra that everyone goes to church on Sunday, which was good news for her parents. But the northern part of Ghana is Muslim. And I think that's true in Nigeria too. The southern part is Christian, the northern part is Muslim. And I mean, I think life is very difficult at this point in Africa, as you must be reading, right? The conflict is real and in some cases deadly. I don't know where that's going. There was another comment from Marilyn. Would Doug comment on the modern use of the term evangelical versus the earlier mission-oriented use of the word? And Marilyn says she was raised in the Evangelical Lutheran Church. Well, yes, not just the Evangelical Lutheran Church, but many European churches continue to use the word evangelical in their names. So in the US, the term evangelical has been taken to mean something very different from what it once meant. Is there somebody else who would like to comment about that?
Well, I think a political party has hijacked
I was going to use that
the word
too.
evangelical, and it has become conflated with Christian nationalism for a lot of people, and that's unfortunate.
Thanks for just blurting it out.
I think evangelical and fundamentalist are two distinct ideas, but they've often been blurred in everyone's mind. An evangelical is much broader definition than fundamentalism. And fundamentalism really only grew up in the 20th century, and it's very literal Bible reading, and there were 5 points of fundamentalism. I can't remember what all of them were, but you can be an evangelical, I think, basically means you believe that your religion should be preached to other people, that it is for someone else. You believe you have something to give someone else. And that may be one reason why it's so richly resented, because many people believe that each culture develops their own religions and you have no right to cross your culture over and try to give a religion to someone else. They object to the basic idea of trying to share your religion outside your own ethnic group or whatever. I'm not an expert, but Doug, do you see that as, we have a few other people in here who know more about this than I do, but
I speak in
So
that's my idea.
if I can say one word about how the history of that word, it did emerge in response to fundamentalism. I think Billy Graham, the founding of Fuller Seminary, these were ways for Christians to emerge from the fundamentalist culture. And they had a little more intellectual integrity, at least that they strived for intellectual integrity. So at the beginning, evangelical had a very, the word evangelical had a very positive connotation.
Okay.
Oh, the founding of Christianity Today. Did I mention that? That would also be part of the. Yeah, Warren, go ahead.
Actually, it's Carolyn, but that's go ahead.
The reason I wanted to get on was one of the things that he kept talking about is how Christianity was spread to the U.S. was with Moravian missionaries. I think that there was an awfully lot of the history of the spread of Christianity to the States and other places that was not acknowledged. And one thing that I learned, I studied world history, world religions. And one thing that the great awakening of the 1800s, he kept talking about it coming from Moravian. Actually, the very beginning of that took place in a prayer meeting in the basement of one of the Reformed churches in New York City. So there are some things that were missed and not included in his discussion. And I think he put more emphasis on some of the emotional ministries than he did on some of the historical, and see what other people may think on that issue.
Well, thank you for that. I think he did give short shrift to the Moravians, who are known for far more than their emotional intensity. Some of you may even subscribe to the daily email. That's its current form. But the email gives a Bible verse for each day with a little bit of commentary that goes with it. The Moravians were very serious about scripture. And so one of the reasons they came into being was that they wanted to emphasize scripture in a way that the Roman Catholic Church did not. So I'm surprised McCullough didn't give expression to that. It was not all about the emotional intensity.
I think an interesting subject today, for the future anyway, is the future of Christianity, or Christianity today in the United States. Is it going up? Is it going down? The involvement of the evangelical churches in the political situation. A lot of people think today that churches are big businesses. The mega churches, they look at their pastors who have these multi-million-dollar homes all over the place. It's a very, are the youth today leaving churches, or is it increasing? Now, I think I see people leaving churches today. And the sexual scandals, everything put together is people, I think, will not be as religious as they have been in the past.
In the West.
In the West, yes. And I don't know what's going to replace it, or just plain agnostics, or what is going on. But I'm not an expert in religions, and I don't. But I would certainly like to see what the situation is today. And I think one of the things that I see churches in the United States is the church leaders have done a terrible job of speaking out about racism. They have not spoken out, any of them. And I think that's part of the problem with racism today. And anyway, that's my thoughts for today.
I'm wondering if the emphasis now on with a lot of people is meditation, and has this affected the basic faith of people in a specific religion, or has it either way expanded it or cut it off?
There was a
Well-
wonderful article in the New York Times a week or so ago about the state of religion today in the US, and especially among younger people. And I think, just to summarize it, I think what's going on is that there's clearly a backing off from identifying with a particular denomination or particular religious tradition. And so young people, if they have any religious faith at all, tend to be very eclectic in their beliefs. Ruth Graham is the religion editor, religion writer for the New York Times. And if you find her article, she tracks this in a very effective way.
Doug, quick question. You made the comment or talked about the comment about drifting away from the teachings of Jesus. Referring to the doctrine of original sin, I don't believe Christ talked about that, but it seems like the religion of my youth had to do with ministers pounding the pulpits, talking about groveling before the throne, about guilt, blame, fault, and all of this sort of thing. I think what a difference it would have made in my thoughts about Christianity if we didn't have the doctrine of original sin.
It sounds like you grew up in a tradition similar to mine. So I told somebody recently that if I make it to heaven, I'm going to be in the surprise group, the ones who are surprised to be there. Go ahead, Linda.
Well, I was going to mention that the spiritual, not religious group seems to be much more prevalent now than people actually belonging to a particular denomination, especially in the young people. And they've seemed to really have adopted the social, justice, more active in that. And just that word religion itself, doesn't it have a Greek root to it that means like religament, union with God? I mean, so I think it's a both and rather than an either or approach, the spiritual, not religious, that's what I've encountered, especially with young people.
Thanks, Linda. I just want to mention that Jane wanted to give credit to the pastors in the CRC and the RCA who have spoken out against racism. There are some brave souls out there, and some of them take a big risk by saying what they do. But yes, there are some pastors out there who have dared to speak.
It's kind of interesting that America started out with the concept of separation of church and state. And then starting with the religious right, I think in the 90s, Ralph Reed, there's been this push to get back into politics and not be a voice, prophetic voice about race and some of the things that have been wrong in America, and instead be kind of searching for, power through politics. I think that's been to the detriment of the church.
Me too.
One thing I noticed in Doug McCullough's narrative was that he said that white evangelical pastors in the days of slavery had stepped up to lead the abolitionist movement. There were a few, there were some, but Frederick Douglass believed that the subject of slavery could not be raised in white pulpits in the North. And when he came north at the age of 19, he expected there to be a great deal of discussion of slavery and the wrongness of slavery in the churches in the North. And he was shocked to find that it was a great silence. And when he went to England in 1847 and was able to preach there, especially in some of the Scottish churches, he could enter the pulpit. I believe he said that he had never been invited to speak in a pulpit anywhere in the North, in spite of the fact that he, by that time, was the best known Black speaker in the North. So the fact that the pastors in the churches felt that slavery shouldn't be brought up because it's too controversial was unfortunately probably true in the North, and then in the South, the pastors were getting up in the pulpit and vociferously defending slavery in the pulpit, maybe not every week, but it was being justified in the South and perhaps a grand silence in the North. So in my mind, we have an open question about to what extent were the typical white preachers in the North who should have been speaking about this, leaving it out of the pulpit. I will say that in Holland today, as far as I know, the only two churches that have displayed a Black Lives Matter sign, if anyone knows of others, please let me know, are the two downtown, Hope and Third. And I've spoken to the people who put those up at both churches just because of curiosity. At Hope Church, they did have some backlash. They lost a few members, but they decided it was the right thing to do. One of the criticisms was, you're trying to defund the police. And so one of the elders called the Holland Police Department and asked them, does our Black Lives Matter sign hinder the work of the Holland Police Department? And the police chief said no. So the elders considered that to have been due diligence, decided the complaint didn't apply to Holland, and left the sign up. It's been up for 2 years, and it has a Reformed Church logo on the sign. Third Church put the sign up just about 6 weeks after the election, and they received quite a bit more backlash, produced a real crisis in the church. And so they pulled together they called in an outside mediator. They met with two groups of people, the people who were complaining and some members of the church. They didn't come in to argue with the governing elders, because that's the wrong way to set it up. Set it up with a group of members who endorse the sign and those who don't. And they had extensive discussions. It was a very difficult period. They came up with a long document that will be new restraints on the governing elders about what they can post, and hoped that that was peace. But I learned about a week ago that most of those people left the church anyway.
Wow.
So
that's one of those choices that people can make, unfortunately.
Difficult it can be, because otherwise I would be quite critical of ministers for not getting up there in the pulpit and saying what you have to say, or governing elders. After all, it's the governing elders who run the show, not the minister himself. It's not personal decisions of the minister. That gives a safety shield around the minister, that his elders are the ones who make these decisions and should take the heat when something goes awry. But it is a very important and difficult problem about how would, like the churches in Holland, we have 177 churches in Holland. So I guess you have to do something, skateboards or something, to be able to hold your own in that kind of an environment. The other thing that's interesting is everyone thinks of Reformed and Christian Reformed as being the dominant religions in Holland. 177 churches and only 18 of them are Reformed. So that's not dominating the waterfront. Many of them are older churches and maybe a little bit bigger, but it's interesting to see this. But I feel that the number of Black Lives Matter signs that you see around Holland on yards, you can, nobody argues that you can't put it up in front of your house or on your business. So I think we do see an interesting number of Black Lives Matter signs here and there. I'm sorry if I told too much about what occurred with these two churches, but it is common knowledge among the members of the church, and it's in the spirit that everybody's trying to seek what is the best way of doing this in our style of church life, with the restraints that we have and what the results are going to be.
Okay, thank you, Linda, for your comments about this, the difficulty sometimes of putting social justice with your faith together. It can be difficult. Doug, is there anything you want to say about next week before we leave? Because we're over our time limit at this point.
Yep, terrible thing. We went way over. The title for next week is God in the Dock. And McCullough is going to try to bring it all together. He's got some very good questions to ask about the future of the church. So
See you all next week.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon. And we will see you later.
Judy, would you stick around?
Sure.